and say welcome to everybody who's joining us for the virtual launch of our new edition, our Recovered Books edition of this very long disappeared book called Trance by Appointment. So rare, there you go. This book is so rare that really the only copies outside of maybe a couple of university libraries in the US are the public registry libraries in the UK. So the British Library, the Bodleian, the National Library of Scotland, et cetera. So there are literally less than a dozen copies of the book, at least cataloged and available. And we'll talk about that when I get to the little presentation. So we're going to start with a short kind of presentation for those of you who are not familiar with Gertrude Trevelyan, who has kind of been my cause celeb for a few years here now. I'm going to give you a little background about her life and her works. Then Louisa Treger, who's very graciously contributed the introduction to this edition, is going to kind of give some reflections on the book. And then finally, Becky Bowler is going to kind of set it into the context from a literary and historical and social standpoint, because Trevelyan isn't, if you go look for Trevelyan's work in anywhere, she's not in the reference book, no one's written any journal articles about her work. So it's really an archaeological experiment to put her back into her context since she essentially disappeared from it. So let me start with a little presentation here. So our guests, of course, have been introduced. So let's talk about who was Gertrude Trevelyan. She was born in 1903 in Bath, the only surviving child of a couple who lived there. Her parents her father was, as you can see from the census form from I think this is 1911. He had private means, so he didn't have a job. As far as I can see from his records, he or his gardeners competed in floral competitions occasionally. He seemed to like to ride because he was a member of a riding club, and that was it. He didn't have any exceptional accomplishments. And he was not part of the better known Trevelyan family like Charles Trevelyan, who was the Home Secretary at one point. So this was essentially an upper middle class, comfortably off, but so you can see they had a couple of maids, they had a nurse and a cook, and a small little intimate family. She went to a private girls' college school, private means. And then she attended Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, which was, of course, a pivotal women's college in Oxford, one of the first ones there. And she was there in the 20s when actually it was still somewhat controversial about women being undergraduates at Oxford. In fact, her first notoriety kind of coincided with two kind of events. First of all, when her graduation from Oxford was held, she was awarded the Newdigate Prize, which is an annual prize among undergraduates for a poem of up to 300 lines on a set topic. It's a prize that in the past had been won by people like Oscar Wilde, won the prize when he was at Oxford. But she was the first woman to win the Newdigate Prize. And that alone became worldwide news. So I have tracked down newspaper stories about Trevelyan winning the Newdigate Prize everywhere from Adelaide, Australia to Walla Walla, Washington. Big news. Now, I would not say she was any great shakes as a poem. The poem was published in limited edition by Blackwell's. There's a copy at the British Library. It's not anything that one walks down the street reciting lines from. It's called Julia, Daughter of Claudius, which is about an old Roman myth told in Julian Simon's history of the Renaissance about them digging up the body that of a Roman woman named Julia, that they traced her history and had some sort of legend about that. Uh, and then after that, she moved to London in the late 20s, around 1930. She took a flat in Notting Hill on Lansdowne Road. Uh, Very likely the flat was purchased or rented by her parents. And that's kind of the end of her story because at that point, she pretty much just stayed there. She didn't move and she started writing. So in 1932, her first book appeared, a novel called Appius and Virginia, which is about a middle-aged woman who decides essentially to inject meaning in her life. She's starting to despair that she'll just become another old woman in a woman's hotel in London. So she decides to conduct an experiment where she's going to fast forward evolution by buying a baby orangutan and then raising it as if it's a human child. And so Appius in Virginia is the story about how Virginia Hutton, this spinster, buys a house out, a relatively isolated house in a small village in the country, and raises this ape by potty training him and teaching him to wear clothes and tries to teach him to read, etc. What's fascinating about the book is I honestly say I wrote this book, I read this book first because I thought it was going to be sort of like a book that came out around the same time called by John Collier called His Monkey Wife, which is a very funny book. If you haven't ever read it, you should. It is a great satire on Edwardian mores and manners, where a Anglican minister falls in love with a chimpanzee while he's on a mission in the Congo and brings her back to London. And the joke of the whole novel is that the monkey wife is actually much sharper and more astute than her thick-headed husband. So I thought it was going to be something like that, and it's not at all. It's a very dark novel because it exposes essentially the inability of two species to ever bridge that gap of consciousness and understanding. And Virginia, essentially, it's a battle of will against nature, and in the end, we'll find out. If you read it, you'll find out which one wins. Um, it was not necessarily well received. So one of the premier critics of the time, James Agate, called it, I love this, pretentious puling twaddle, which is one of the great review phrases I think ever penned. But not everybody thought it was bad. And in fact, Gerald Gould, who was also an important critic of the time, saw that it was quite remarkable, original, powerful, all of which is true. But it's a very different write. It's very impressionistically written. She takes advantage of modernist tropes that have already come out and modernist approaches. So it's stream of consciousness through actually the two through Virginia's sensibilities, but also through Appius's perception. So there are passages where you're seeing the world through Appius's eyes, through his limited vocabulary, if you will. Her next book, Hot House, came out the next year. This was really much sort of a backstabbing reflection on her time at Lady Margaret Hall. I don't think Trevelyan enjoyed university very much. And she said, actually, after the fact, she said after the fact that she sort of deliberately didn't take part in any sort of activities whatsoever. But it's sort of like about the claustrophobic world of a woman's college in the 1920s, where there's a lot of gossiping and backstabbing and mating up in friendships of various flavors of unresolved sexual connections. It is sort of overwritten, in my opinion. A good editor should have probably cut out about 150 pages of it. And it's extremely high strung in its tone. So I don't personally think it's that great of a book. It's an intense book, but it's not necessarily a interesting piece of literature. Her next book is, in some ways, I think her greatest artistic achievement, as it was in the beginning, came out in 34. As it was in the beginning, takes place entirely in the mind of a woman who has suffered a massive stroke. She's in a care home by the seaside, and she's approaching her death. And the way the book is written is you have two streams of narrative running interspersed, intertwined. You have the linear time towards her death. So she approaches death. By the end of the book, she dies, but at the same time, her thoughts are going back through her life in reverse, so that just as she's coming to the moment of death, she's also remembering her very earliest memories as a child, literally to the point that she remembers being born, which is a fascinating to intertwine all of those and make it all work. I think is a remarkable accomplishment. After that, she wrote a book called War Without a Hero, which I also scanned at the British Library and read, and I wouldn't recommend anybody who isn't a Trevelyan completist to seek this one out. I think it's a completely messed up book. It's about a flighty divorcee from London who goes to a remote Channel island and lives with a fisherman's family to sort of like drop out of sight while her notoriety is at its peak. And she gets involved with the young son of the family, and it's overwrought and overwritten and just a complete mess, in my opinion. And in fact, my favorite line of any of her reviews. So A.G. MacDonald, who was writing for the Bystander at that time, saying it was a book that made him want to go out and shoot himself. Um, and then her next book was the first that we published, or republished, which has got this bizarre title of 2000 Million Manpower, which is among one of the worst titles ever invented by a novelist. It turns out that this did have a source, and I traced this down to an economic history that she must have read, where it was contrasting the efficiency of a mechanized society from that of, say, a less developed society of the time, like China, and essentially the fact that an average worker in England or America in a factory with automation was producing, significant orders of magnitude more efficiency to the extent of 2000 million manpower or billion manpower. And this is a book that's very saturated with the events of the time. So Trevelyan intersperses headlines and radio excerpts and advertisements throughout her text. So it's a little bit the kind of approach that John Dos Passos took in his USA trilogy, very immersed in the current events of the day. So you can trace, it follows a couple from 1919 to the mid 30s. And as they develop, and it goes through the general strike experience and the depression. So the man in the couple loses his job and goes through a period of just crushing depression and from unemployment and the sense of devaluement. And this is the only I've seen two letters by Trevelyan. So among other things, we have a problem with her is that there's virtually nothing in the archives as a footprint. The only letters I've ever seen by her, uh, she sent to a fan in Indiana, and so they're in the University of Indiana archives. And she writes about the fact that 2000 million manpower, she had to do so much research and had to trace what was going on in society and as she put the book together. Her next book came out in 38, William's Wife. So among the other things you notice is she produced at a phenomenal rate as a novelist to consider that most of these books are well structured, well written, and quite different in terms of subject. William's Wife, we republished a while ago, 2 years ago almost now. And it's about a woman who's a lady's helper who marries a grocer, a widower, and he's such a stingy man. He's such a coercive control freak that she takes on all of his worst habits. And even after he dies, she becomes so penny pitching that towards the end of the book, she starts buying her meat from the cat's meat man in the market because it's cheaper than buying meat from the butcher shop. And then she goes on to start scavenging and actually takes food out of bins. She starts patrolling the bins around the markets and taking food that's been thrown away by the vendors in the marketplace. Right, the same year she published a book called Theme with Variations, which is a interest. She calls it a novel. It's really sort of three novellas interspersed. So she follows three very different characters. One is a working man who injures his back, so he can't work as a mover, furniture mover. The second is a very bright, ambitious young woman who is saddled with essentially a codependency nightmare with her parents and her younger sister who has some disabilities. And then finally, a poorly educated woman who marries a man, but she moves. They take a house out in the countryside, out in the suburbs, and she's essentially isolated socially, but also physically. So she can't get out and get around. And in all three of these characters keep saying to themselves, they're unhappy with their situation, and the theme keeps repeating throughout the book, which is I've got to go do something about it. I've got to get out and do something. And of course, each one of them is trapped in one way or another from being doing that. They don't have full agency, so to speak. And then the last book she wrote the year after that was Trance by Appointment, this kind of oddball book, which focuses on this young working class London woman named Jean, following her from childhood up to adulthood. And Jean's gift, if you will, is that she has psychic powers, and they seem to be natural as Trevelyan conveys them. They seem to be a genuine ability she has that she actually doesn't quite understand. She never fully understands it. She never feels fully in control of it. But she also, clearly is able to have some sort of genuine psychic ability. And the tragedy of the story is that she becomes exploited by particularly a man who marries her and uses her essentially as a money-making machine. And then the war broke out, and in October of 1940, during the Blitz, Trevelyan's flat was bombed. She was injured, and she went home her parents took her home to Bath, and she died on the 1st of March the following year. And with that, she just disappeared. She just disappeared in the sense that literally nowhere in any reference book, guide to literature, the English novel of the time, etc. She's not there at all. Her books completely fell out of print. And then as I said, I kind of stumbled across a reference to Appius in Virginia and just thought I would seek it out as a novelty book. And this was in 2018. And I was so struck by the power of that book that I tracked down when it was still possible to buy a few, even as rare as they were, I could buy most of her books and read them and wrote about them on Neglected Books. And I also researched her life. At one point, I was thinking about doing my dissertation on her life, but unfortunately, two things fortuitously happened. COVID happened, and the archives got locked up. But it's a good thing for me because actually, I wouldn't have probably found much had I gone looking for it in the first place. But I put together a Wikipedia page, so we start to get her into the record. A guy named Scott Pack, who runs is a longtime professional in the publishing business and runs an imprint from Eye and Lightning Books called The Abandoned Bookshop, decided he was interested in Appius in Virginia. So this came out in the end of 2020. And then when I had the opportunity to start the Recovered Books series, I knew that this was going to be part of my mission, is to bring her books back in a good packaging, looking at it from serious works. Each book so far has had an academic afterword that sets some context for that. And I should mention we will be bringing out uh, our own edition of Appius in Virginia next year because it's hard to find the Eye and Lightning abandoned bookshop edition in the U.S. And also this gives us a more uniform edition of the novels of Trevelyan. Now, I mentioned Trance by appointment. Here's 7 copies in libraries worldwide. It turns out there are about 4 or 5 more, so that's number's a little bit off, but this is an extremely rare book. I've never seen this book come up for sale anywhere. Uh, Unfortunately, when I went to the British Library to scan a copy of it, my objective was simply to read it. So one of the things I have to thank Becky and Louisa for is putting up for the atrocious scan, because if you know the British Library, you're supposed to only scan a limited number of pages by their rules, but they don't tend to police the scanning stations. And if you're lucky, you can stand there and scan in a whole book, which is exactly what I did. But I did it, on the sly and very quickly. So this was a terrible book scan to work with. And the fact that you were willing to read it is a sign of your commitment to this project. So with that, I'm going to stop our little talk, and I would like to, if we can, at this point, if I can ask Louisa. So I contacted you. We knew each other from the Pilgrimage Project, and I mentioned
That's
this
right.
project to you, and you amazingly agreed. Tell us what your reactions were when you first encountered this text.
Of course. Well, yes, I'm going to talk about my reactions coming to it without any prior knowledge of Trevelyan, because when you approached me to write the introduction to Trance by appointment, I'd never heard of her. And so I started reading with no background knowledge, no expectations, and no preconceived ideas. And I think that's quite a rare thing, really. It made it more powerful. There is something rare about finding a book without knowing what kind of journey it's going to take you on. It doesn't happen that much anymore because you've normally read reviews, or it's been recommended by a friend or whatever. And I found the journey Trance took me on turned out to be both absorbing and quietly devastating. I was very struck by Jean's marriage to the unscrupulous astrologer Norman Mitch, who you've mentioned already, because it's a perfect rendition of a coercive, controlling relationship. And I really thought, actually, where did that come from? Because Trevelyan never married. Did she have a
Right.
relationship that we didn't know about? Did she maybe have a friend go through that? Because it's just pitch perfect. Um, so he exploits her for financial gain, as you've said, and he organizes these seances for her, which he makes a lot of money from them. And then he gets her pregnant, and childbirth and exhaustion disrupt the seances. And he takes his anger out on her as though he's played no part in getting her pregnant. He abandons her periodically, he gaslights her. We watch her children grow up and we see the devastating effect on them of having a father like that. But I think the main thing I was struck by, the main thing I'd like to talk about is Trevelyan's style and the effect it has on the reader. So from the opening pages, we're drawn directly into Jean's consciousness. And there's a fluid narrative style that mixes authorial narration with a colloquial tone. And although the language is very informal, the overwhelming effect is one of claustrophobia. I mean, extreme claustrophobia. Jean's options in life are very limited, and she has no agency. I was asking myself, why doesn't she leave her husband? Why doesn't she go back to her parents or start her own, psychic business? But she never does. And the narrative slips between third person and first person and back again in a way that reminded me of earlier modernist British writers like Virginia Woolf and Dorothy Richardson. And maybe she's more like Richardson because it's an evocation of a working class life with all its pain and struggles. But where it differs markedly from Richardson is that Richardson gives us this sort of lyrical outpouring of stream of consciousness. It goes on and on and on for 12 wonderful volumes. But Jean's thoughts are expressed in brief, repetitive phrases. And it's as though the language is really trapped like she is. The language is almost enacting her state of mind. And I thought I'd read you a very brief passage just to give you a flavour of it, those who don't know her work. And the extract I've chosen comes from the early part of the novel when Gina's still kind of honing her psychic gift. She's training, she's not quite there, but she's getting there. Often at night, she put the light out and sit looking at the dark out of the window. When you looked hard, you could see where the top of the wall was across the yard. And there was a tin roof in the yard on the other side of the wall. You could just see it. And it used to catch the light if there was a window lit anywhere, especially if it had been raining. Jean used to sit and look at that bit of bright light reflected on the tin roof in the next yard, because you had to have something like that to help you concentrate. That was what Madame Eva used to say, and that was what the crystal ball was for. If you looked hard at something long enough, you'd go off, if you were lucky, and see things. So you can see by, the repetitions of these words, light and yard and roof and so on. It's like almost a circular, stuck narrative, and the effect is completely hypnotic. So, the book is about the slow wearing down of Jean, really, but somehow it carries the suspense of a psychological thriller. And at times it's almost unbearable. You want to stop. It's like watching a train smash. You really want to stop reading. And at the same time, you absolutely can't. And I couldn't quite work out how Trevelyan achieved this effect. And that made it even more compelling. So I think trance is powerful and thought-provoking. It stayed with me long after I'd finished it, leaving me troubled and uncertain. So, new readers of Trevelyan prepare to be haunted. And the final point is that I was struck by how relevant it is. Even though it was written nearly 100 years ago, we're still grappling with some of the issues it raises, such as the dynamics of a abusive relationship and how women are so often told what they must think and feel about themselves, even, when it comes to their own experiences. So I am delighted, Brad, that you and Boiler House Press have brought out new editions of her work, because I think, now finally it can be brought to wider um, audiences. And I've read William's Wife and Trance, and based on those two novels alone, she deserves far more attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Louisa. Yeah, I mean, to me, one of the mysteries of Trevelyan is how did this, university educated, comfortably off woman
Mhm.
penetrate into such and capture voices that were how did she do this? I kind of picture that she might have spent a lot of time riding around on buses in London eavesdropping on
Yes,
conversations, because
yes,
she picks up the
yes.
diction, the expressions, and sort of the mindset so well, and this is not her world at all. At least there's no
No,
evidence that we
totally.
to think it was her world.
Yeah, no, exactly. And she didn't seem to go much out into the world because she had an income. She didn't teach. You know, she wasn't kind
Yeah,
of,
and
as far as
there
I
is
know,
some
mingling with
evidence.
the, yeah,
Go
with the
ahead.
kind of other literary people. So yeah, where did that breadth of experience come from?
Well, Anne Kennedy
It's just one
Smith,
of the things.
who contributed the afterword for William's wife, uh, did dig up some evidence, and I found sort of traces. I think Trevelyan might also have suffered from tuberculosis and had been I think there are several times where her name shows up at a large hospital in London, and another time out in Kent in a tuberculosis clinic. So it may also have been that her health was not good to start with. And in fact, the cause of her death is tuberculosis plus injuries.
Okay, that's interesting. So that may have given her access to different worlds.
It
We
may,
can
I
only
mean, but
speculate.
again, it's in some ways, I'm personally one who I don't like the new criticism approach. I like the understanding the biographical context of a writer, but in a way, Trevelyan denies us that because we have so little record of what. So we do have to just engage with the text. We can't find her
Mm,
letters. We
mm,
can't
mm.
find her diary. We can't find the mentions of her in any other writer or critic's memoirs of the time. So that's all we have is her books. So
Which are
Becky,
extraordinary.
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think they at least merit to be in print and to be considered. But maybe Becky can share some thoughts about this from the academic perspective.
Yeah, I actually will start by piggybacking on a couple of those points. One, Brad, I think in the 1930s in London, there were quite a few opportunities for people to mingle across classes, that perhaps she never knew anyone from the working class personally, and to call them a friend. But if she's in a tea shop, as you say, on a bus, she's possibly going to the Lion's Corner House, she's overhearing people on the street. You've got that kind of interwar period as well, where people are marching about, uh, ex-soldiers out of work, that kind of thing, as well as racism and anti-Semitism, and just a lot of kind of bustling street life in London that I suspect as a novelist she will have been hanging around the edge of those crowds and listening in. And I'm thinking about, Theme with Variations as well, where the way that she ventriloquizes the male working class character and his motivations out of work is astonishing, much in the same way, she puts herself so completely in his head that you believe in him. Absolutely. Um, and then, Louisa, I wanted to piggyback on your point about the stream of consciousness, which is very predictable from me. I know, as a fellow Richardson fan, and also a Mason Clare fan, um, uh, I think this is really interesting that she does this, and that she's doing it in the 1930s, because of course, as we know, Richardson was doing this from 1915. This was very, very early. And then, Sinclair after having labeled it Stream of Consciousness, then comes out a little bit later in the 1910s with her book Mary Olivier, 1919, in which she does the same thing. And I think really by I don't know, by the end of the 1920s, to be generous, I think that style had had its day. It was no longer fashionable. And instead, people were starting to privilege a kind of economy or precision in the way that they represented consciousness. And Stream of Consciousness has had such a deep and lasting marked effect on the way that people tell stories, that you can't get away from it now. I've just finished some undergraduate marking, and they're very keen on the phrase, and they will apply it to anything and everything, including novels that were written just last year, sometimes with some justification. But I think the Richardson sprawling style in which everything is narrated, every passing thought, every mood, every dapple of sunlight, back into her memories, back into the present, back into the memories again. And then suddenly you find out that she's actually been walking along Euston Road all the time. And the last time her physical location was mentioned was 50 pages ago, but you've been in her head. So that kind of that depth, I think, is waning by the time Gertrude Trevelyan's beginning to write. But instead, she's trying to do something that's a little bit more simple, a little bit more pared back, but still very stylish. She's still giving you that emotional depth and that emotional connection with the character. And what it reminds me of, and this, I don't think I put this in my afterwards because it only occurred to me more recently, is Jean Rhys, and the ways that she writes her 1920s and her 1930s protagonists, which are all women, to the extent that if you read them all quite close together, you sometimes get muddled, which one is which book has which character. I still get slightly confused. But they're all single, they're all on their own, essentially, although they have affairs and they have relationships with men, but they never go well, and they have to pawn their fur coats in order to pay for the hotel, or more usefully, just throw your suitcase out of the hotel window and then jump after it, or sneak past the receptionist pretending that you're just going out. So it's poverty, it's deprivation, it's sex, it's power struggles, it's all of that. And I think Gertrude Trevelyan is doing a very similar thing. And I was thinking about Rhys's novel The Voyage in the Dark, or A Voyage in the Dark, which is from 1934, and so one of her later kind of single woman novels. And she herself, Jean Rhys, quite famously described this book as being written in words of one syllable, like a kitten mewing, which I think is a really interesting way of describing her style. But it's a very similar, way of thinking, okay, if my protagonist wouldn't know these long words, or wouldn't think in long sentences with multiple clauses, like Dorothy Richardson's Miriam does think in long sentences with multiple clauses, but she's a particular kind of woman, but this character might not. And so how do I represent the way that her thought process will work, which is going to be a little bit more pared back. I also think it owes a lot to those kind of interwar novels that we call now the domestic novel, which can variously be things like Elizabeth von Arnim's Vera and Father, both of which are novels about a woman at the behest of the men in her life, or the one single man in her life. Either they're overbearing and you have to carve a space for yourself within that framework, or they've died and left you with no money, and then you have to work out what you do once the patriarch has let you down. And Vera is from 1921, and Father is from 1931, and again it's that kind of exploration of what does one do if your safety net has gone, or if you've invested the whole of yourself into a man and then he's let you down. I think as well Sylvia Townsend Warner, some of her books deal with that in quite interesting ways. In Lolly Willows, she is a spinster and she just decides, sod the family, I'm going off to live in a cottage on my own in the countryside and have a great time. I won't tell you what happens in the end, in case you haven't read it. brilliant twist. And I don't know, I suppose one is The Corner That Held Them as well, which is about a community of nuns making do without men at all, but it's still quite claustrophobic. And I think so she's drawing on those ideas of what can women do within the kind of limited means, and I'm sure there's some experts here as well in interwar women's fiction, so you can come up with your own examples. There are more, you know, either a man who is too much there and physically oppressing you, or a man who abandons you. And Trance Without Appointment is, in a really interesting way, both. He's too much there, and when he's there, she feels oppressed by his presence, and when he's not there, she's abandoned. So you know, she can't really cope with it either way. So that's, she's dealing with the gendered aspects of what women can do, really being inspired by that movement in the interwar period. And then I think she's being inspired as well by the more kind of gritty social realism that's coming out in the mid 1930s. So probably, I mean, I don't know if people will have read it, but I feel like you might have heard the title of Walter Greenwood's Love on the Dole, which was really a very famous book at the time. It was a bestseller. People were talking about it, and the reason why it was so hard hitting is because you know, it dealt with real lives and real poverty in a way that did not whitewash, did not gild, did not romanticize, but it was also funny. So you know, this kind of interweaving of real moments of almost gallows humor, and you know, interesting human relationships that you feel that you can identify with, and that you feel affection for these people, but real deprivation is also quite shocking at the same time. And of course, George Orwell writing throughout the 1930s. Right. You know, his series of books, some fictional, some memoirs with some elements of fiction interwoven, I think. But I was thinking about his book, A Clergyman's Daughter, which again is mid 1930s, it's 1935, in which, again, it's a similar trope to that interwar women's writing of, you know, and Richardson and Sinclair, where, you know, there's a genteel middle-class woman from a lettered family, if not a wealthy family, who suddenly finds herself out on the streets and having to cope and fend for herself, and the disparity between her previous situation and the new one. And in A Clergyman's Daughter, it's a little bit contrived in that she's lost her memory, and that's why she's suddenly on the street, you know, falling in with tramps, you know, so-called because they're tramping the countryside, moving from one place to another in search of seasonal work, and then for a while in London, you know, sleeping out in Trafalgar Square with everybody else in a huddle in order to keep warm in the winter. And, you know, again, kind of really showing the deprivation, the emotional resonance of what it means to have absolutely nothing, or what it means to feel trapped by circumstance. So I think she's also playing with these ideas, but doing something new with them, I think, that that hasn't been done before. The psychic element, I think, is, you know, genius. It's fascinating. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing that strikes me, having, you know, read all her books, and I think it's probably most pronounced in theme with variations. I mean, she is definitely talking about people who are disabled in terms of their ability to control their lives. And it's never quite clear how much of that is essentially societal, how much of that is psychological, how much of it is education. I mean, one of the things that I think Jean struggles with in Trance is she's not a very well educated person. And so, you know, when she's looking for her options, her menu is quite short, right? It's get a job and then have kids, and that's the end of, you know, that's it. That's what you do. And so
Tries
she
having a
doesn't think
job,
about
but
escaping. I mean, if she has a sense that she needs to escape, she has no clue about what would be the steps that she would take.
I think this is what Trevelyan does that's different though as well, is that because she does have a job at the beginning, right? She works in a
Right.
cigarette stall, but she can't do it because she is such an empath that every time the factories kick out and the places of work kick out and too many people are coming towards her and wanting to buy a packet of cigarettes or some matches or whatever, that their emotions are writ large on their face. She feels their pain, she feels their frustration at having to go into the factory, she feels their sense of entrapment, and it's too much for her and she faints. So
Yeah.
she can't work the kinds of jobs that would ordinarily be open to her as a working class woman, because she's feeling too much and she's picking up other people's psychic pain. And I think that's a really interesting twist. It's an almost magical realism.
Well, I think that, I mean, that passage where she is experiencing her job in the little cigarette stand in the tube station is amazing from that standpoint, because it does, you do realize that this is not something she could survive doing.
We've all felt like that when with service work of some kind, right? At some point in our lives. Too much.
Well, I want to take a few moments if there's anybody in the audience has a question or comment they want to raise about the book or about Trevelyan. We certainly would like to hear from you. We're still trying to get the word out. I mean, we've got 4 books out now, but I won't claim that sales have been astonishing. I think these are books that are they're not sunny books. I mean, I think that's one of the things I find fascinating is that uh, she is intense. She is claustrophobic, as Louisa said. I mean, there are powerful narratives, but they don't take you to fun places. And there's nothing nostalgic about any of her books. You don't get a sense that these are worlds that anybody would want to go back to. And I do have to say, in the context of the middle brow, the interest in British middle brow women writers, that there's a certain amount of comfort and nostalgia I think it gets associated with some of them, and that is not Trevelyan at all. And I think it probably turns some people off. They're a little bit reluctant to undertake her work because they know it's not going to have a lot of tea being served. Okay, if there are no questions from folks in the audience, um, I just want to take a moment to talk about where we're going with the Recovered Books series.
I would like to, oh,
Oh, go ahead, please.
right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I watched a YouTube presentation and I came away with that thinking that where did she get, all of her ideas from? And I did think some of it was from observation, but she seems such a recluse, and this has already come up with her. How did she get in those situations where she could observe people, and I'm glad it's come out that she well, not glad she had tuberculosis, but that put her in a situation where she could from time to time see people with medical problems. William's wife, my grandfather was ill for a number of years following an accident. In the 60s, he was in a hospital and they had so many different people in there. He wasn't allowed to leave, but you had Japanese ex-prisoners of war that were exhibiting, PTSD or were catatonic and all these different things. And William's wife, was something that came out of my grandmother's observations on a nearby neighbor who had a terrible incident that happened to her, and over a period of years was her mental degeneration until she was scavenging through bomb sites and things like that. And I think that a lot of stuff as well with the trance, mediums and seances were so popular, especially but the 2 world wars, relatives of casualties were going to mediums, and there was a lot of money. And Helen Duncan springs to mind, if you look at her case, and she was something of a cash cow for her family, you know. And I think perhaps these women were popular, and it was generally women that did it, and were seen as cash cows by their husbands or by their family and people like that. And it would have been in the newspapers because they were advertising, you know, for custom, and there was quite a lot of money to be made in it. So it's really, really interesting, and I'd really quite like to read some of her books. And thank you for your presentation and all of your input, all the three of you tonight. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There was a comment from Joe McCarthy asking about the sales of Trevelyan. I don't have any figures of that except the evidence that I've never seen a second edition of any of, or a second printing of any of her books. And the extraordinary rarity, plus the fact that she had 3 different publishers. So she had Martin Secker for 3 books, I think, 3 or 4 books. Then Victor Gallant for William's Wife and Theme with Variations, and then Harrop for Trance. Probably suggests that her publishers were not going out of their way to hold on to her as an author. So I mean, that's one of the things that affected it. She did, on average, I think, other than the examples that I cited, most of her reviews were positive. Often they were sort of a little bit perplexed by the nature of her work. I think actually one of her best advocates was Leonora Isles, who was the wife of the editor of the TLS at the time. And she reviewed, I think, all of Trevelyan's works for the TLS. Even though in those days TLS didn't credit reviews, their records apparently have that because you can find it online when you look in the archives. You can see who wrote that. And Isles was probably her most consistent advocate through all that period, which I think is interesting because if you know anything about Leonora Isles, she herself was early on a novelist and wrote several novels that are essentially about working class women struggling with their lot. So yeah, I think that's certainly one of the factors is that people weren't, you know, if you look at Virginia Woolf as an example, Virginia Woolf was a best-selling novelist in both the UK and the US. I mean, The Years was at the top of the bestseller list when it came out in the late 30s. Despite the fact that I suspect a lot of people who read it didn't finish it, but you know, she had that reputation that publishers would put out 10,000 copies of her books with the expectations that it would sell, whereas simply the absence of Trevelyan's work on the used market to me indicates the fact that there weren't that many copies sold.
It's interesting though that publishers are thinking that she's a good enough bet that they are picking her up again. I can imagine these days, if one publisher drops you because you're not getting enough sales, your chance of getting in with another publisher is going to be very slim. But maybe that's because she's critically lauded, as you say, Brad, that most of the reviews are positive reviews and people are saying good things about her. The TLS, right, is very influential. And so they think, oh, well, maybe this is the one that's going to break her through.
Yeah.
Because, of course, Virginia Woolf's earlier work wasn't that successful before
No.
in Orlando.
And I think like Gallant published 2 of Trevelyan's books in part because it was very much along the kind of activist socialist theme that he was interested in as a publisher himself.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, in order to get through the publication barrier, I don't know what it was like in the 30s, but I mean, these days, for a publisher to invest in you to actually publish, they must see something in you. So she'd obviously got to that, beyond that barrier, hadn't she? So,
well, the one thing I would say is the publishing one thing that's dramatically changed in publishing between that time and now is that many publishers had no clue what they were doing from a business standpoint, and ruined themselves in the interest of literary value. So there were certainly people. I mean, Gallant's was an example of somebody became a very smart publisher and businessman and lucked into a few bestsellers, but there were also lots of gentleman houses at the time that
That's
were
interesting.
really not.
So
They
they
were
were
not,
quite
profit making didn't seem to be their number
okay.
one concern. And I doubt that they even put together profit and loss sheets.
The publishing houses were quite sort of whimsical then in their own way. They were almost like hobbies, from what you're
Yeah, I mean,
saying.
certainly you can
People could
find, I
take
mean,
huge risks,
yeah,
whereas
I
you
mean, if you
couldn't.
look at Diana Attill's memoirs uh, about and Andre Deutsch she worked for a number of years. It was still sort of casual. A question from Valerie about surviving family. Her parents died, so she died in 41. She was the only child, and she came from a string of sort of only male descendants. That's why she was quite removed from the mainstream of the Trevelyan family. And her parents both died within 5 to 8 years after her death. So the Trevelyans of Bath disappeared. And there's no evidence of, relationships, family connections, etc. So yeah, I keep hoping that we will stumble across a treasure trove of her papers somewhere. They may be out there. And in fact, I just found out, literally last week, I found out that there's an English woman in Luxembourg who inherited her mother, who lived in Brussels for many, many years, inherited from her mother. So this is the a woman in Luxembourg's grandmother was a friend of Trevelyan and has all of her books, which is the only instance I've heard of to date that anybody actually has physical copies of all of her books. So there we may still, I mean, some notoriety may benefit from getting, some more attention and produce some evidence of other work that she's done, because it would certainly be nice to know more about what was going on in her life, in her mind, in terms of the intent of doing these, very unexpected books in the context of where she came from. I just want to take a moment to talk about what's coming up for Recovered Books. So this is our Trance by Appointment is, I think, number 16 in our series so far. And if you're interested, the only thing I will say these books have in common is they're good reads. They have generally been out of print for many years, like Time Stood Still, which is a memoir of a German man who was interned in England during World War I. That book came out in 1930, has never been reissued. So we're happy to bring that one back. And we don't stick to a genre. We don't stick to, we actually have already had our first original translation, Red House Alley. So we're kind of just trying to fill in the gaps of that other folks are missing. Coming up in September, we are going to be reissuing Malachi Whitaker's memoir called "And So Did I," with introduction by Catherine Taylor and afterward by Valerie Waterhouse, who's with us today. This is I think, an amazing book, slim, powerful, and it's the sort of thing, when I first read this, it struck me that in today's marketplace, we are seeing tons of these sort of auto fiction, memoiristic, don't fit into a particular genre books, and they're well understood, and readers like them, publishers like them. And So Did I is sort of like that. But when it came out, people just didn't know what it was. And I think the time may be right now to bring this book out again. And then in November, we'll be bringing about a book that is another case of a writer who completely disappeared. Makeshift by Sarah Campion. Fascinating. Sarah Campion published about 8 or 9 novels over between the mid 30s to the early 50s, everyone quite different. And this one stems from her time in Germany. It's about a German Jewish woman who essentially takes her from 1919 to the time that she decides she has to leave Germany with the rise of the Nazi Party, and then essentially wanders around the world, going to the England, going to South America or South Africa, going to Australia, and ending up in New Zealand, just trying to figure out where am I going to establish myself now that I no longer have a home. A fascinating book, and one of the fascinating things about this book, I think, is this is not a nice person. This is a woman who, when she gets pregnant and delivers her child, she's so overwhelmed by the experience that she leaves the infant on a train and walks away from it. And she's sort of angry about
Brad,
the human. Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Will you excuse me if I slip away because of the prior
Absolutely.
commitment
Thank you
I
so
mentioned?
much, Louisa, for
But
taking
thank
part in
you
this.
so much for having me. Lovely to hear your views, Brad and Becky, and thank you to everybody who came. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Louisa. So let me just wrap up by saying
Bye.
that we have Trance by Appointment is for sale now. You can buy it on the websites, in your bookshops. It's available like all of our books in both paperback and ebook if you like to take them that way. So with that, let me just thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Becky, for offering to or agreeing to write about this writer and this book that were essentially completely unknown to you. And I hope you feel like you've got a little bit of advocacy for Trevelyan now. We'll get a few more apostles out there for the cause célèbre of Gertrude Trevelyan. And thank you all folks for connecting. And I hope if you haven't read Trance by Appointment, I hope you'll give it a try. I think you'll find it a remarkable piece of work, imaginative, uh, stylistically, subject-wise. When you look at little, quiet, sickly Gertrude Trevelyan, and then you read this book, it is really hard to connect those dots for me, except to say she had a remarkable talent. So thank you all for joining us.